or the period during which the British, that that period during which we had colonialism, that was the time Christianity was imposed on Indians. So on the one hand, the government imposed Christianity. At the same time, it used Christianity, or it used the Christian faith to, to deepen the impact of colonization. So through political and through military means, our our country was colonized, physically colonized. Our resources were exploited. Our, even our bodies were colonized. But through spreading their ideology, they colonized our minds also. So this has become a catchphrase. This has become a very popular phrase to implicate Christians and Christian missionaries, that they came and colonized us internally. They colonized our minds, because by spreading the gospel, they imposed an alien ideology on us. And the colonized people and the British colonial officials used that to strengthen their government, strengthen their hold over India. And this is not something that is happening exclusively in India. This is happening in many other parts of the world, where they say that Christian missions were part of the colonial agenda to strengthen their hold over the people. And this has become very popular idea. And incidentally, it was some of the Marxist and some of the Marxist and post-colonial academicians, writers, historians who were spreading this kind of idea. It became very popular, especially in the 1990s, with the very influential book by a South African couple, Jean and John Komaroff. They published a book called On Revelation and Revolution. So they are multi-volume books they published, and one of the books said that Christian faith was the way the colonial forces strengthened their ideas. So the Hindutva government only used that Marxist logic, so which is very ironic and strange. But that has been the idea. So my own study, my own desire and quest is to really understand this phenomenon. Is it really true that colonialism used Christianity, or Christianity became the handmaiden of colonialism? So when I was looking at the history of my own native language, Punjabi, so I started looking at this question, that who were the people who really served the language of Punjabi, and was it imposed, or or was it erased? So those are some of the questions that came to my mind. And these questions, we know, are not just theoretical questions. These are important questions of our day-to-day existence. So I tried to look at it. And when I was studying the history of both the British colonization as well as the missionary engagement in our country, or especially in Punjab, there's some very interesting things that I found out. Now, we have to realize that Punjab, the northwest part of India, was the last area which came under the British control. British began controlling the coastal area of eastern India. They came from Bengal was one of their bases, important bases. They went to Madras and that area over in Bombay. then they came to Awadh, United Provinces. So starting from Bengal and Eastern India in 1757 with after Battle of Plassey and Battle of Buxar. Then in 1765 Treaty of Allahabad, when they actually gained a lot of control over the eastern part. So from 1765 onwards, they kept moving towards the west, and Punjab came under the control of the British only in 1849. So there was a huge uh, gap between how they started and how they captured the rest of the Indian landmass. And we also know one important thing, that East India Company uh, did not allow missionaries to come to the area they controlled. Uh, the East India Company, incidentally, never promoted missionary work. East India Company was a commercial company, and it was here to do business. Due to some twists and turns in history, they ended up also governing the areas in which they were doing trade. So they did not want missionaries to be there. In fact, East India Company was involved in supporting the local religious practices. Now, it is very important that whenever any foreign power comes to another area and wants to establish itself, it must have the support of the people. Now, this is something that we have to understand, that any foreign power, when it wants to establish itself on a foreign land, it must have the support of the local people. And in India, how could East India Company gain the support of the local people? Now, the people in India are very religious, so to gain their support, you must support their religious activities. So the company was actually serving and helping sustain many of the local religious practices. If we look at the working of East India Company, we know that in East India Company had begun supporting, I mean, they were the commercial company, but they supported the religious activities of the Muslims when they supported Calcutta Madrasa. They were financially backing it up. Then later in 1791, I think they also helped found a Sanskrit college in Banaras. So those are the things that they were doing, and they did not really support the missionaries. Missionaries had to fight, a long battle in the parliament from 1793 to 1813. 1813, they got some limited permission to come, and 1833, they got the missionaries were successful in getting the pious clause added to the charter,
Charter
uh,
Act.
the Charter Act of 1833, in which missionaries got that they could preach in the British in the East India controlled territories without license. Now, the British missionaries of Church Missionary Society or London Missionary Society or SPG, they were spread in various other parts. But in Punjab, the people who came to spread the gospel were not the British. The first missionaries who entered the northwest part of India were the American Presbyterians. Now, the first question that arises in our mind is, if Christian missions are supporting colonialism, why did Americans come there? Because Americans, if we look at history, they always had a very strained relationship in terms of religion with England. So it is very strange that you expect Americans to come to serve the colonial interest of the British, Now that is almost like a, it's a laughable and a bizarre claim. We know that Americans actually fought the British. Americans wanted British to leave their nation. They fought battles with them in 1776 when they got their freedom. And if you go back further in the history, we know that the people who founded America, or the first people, Europeans or English who went there, were actually those who were against the British establishment. They were against the English crown and English church. So that's an interesting thing for us to understand, yeah, that the Americans in Punjab, whose uh, interests were this serving. So to say that missionaries always serve the colonial interest is it is not tenable. It is historically and factually not true. Uh, it's interesting because another thing that we need to know is that Punjab, when American missionaries came to India, uh, they of course landed again in Calcutta, and from Calcutta they wanted to go to a region where the gospel hasn't been preached, right? They did not want to go to a region where there are other missionaries, and they didn't want to get in conflict with them, and they wanted to reach the unreached group. So they were in Calcutta, and John Lorry and his wife, and one more missionary, William Reed and his wife, they were the ones who arrived first from the USA. And they said that we would go to an area. So they first wanted to go to the Punjab area, because that's where there were no missionaries. Um, and they decided to go there. Uh, Punjab did not have any Christian population at that time. Historically, there were Christians in Punjab during the time of Akbar. There was a time when Portuguese, they came in the court of Akbar and they met him, and they took the permission from him to do the evangelistic work in Punjab around the Lahore area. And there was a presence of some Catholics in Lahore sometime. They even built a church in Lahore. But after Akbar died, his son Jahangir and the British, and the Portuguese, sorry. So Jahangir and Portuguese had some disagreements, and and Jahangir shut that church. Actually, all the Christians in Lahore and in Punjab, the small congregation, they migrated to Agra. Uh, so, and later the church was actually demolished by Jahangir. These kind of things happened in history. Uh, Religious places were demolished, and that was part of pre-modern times. So, when American Presbyterians came there were no Christians in Punjab. In fact, there are some historical versions which say actually Saint Thomas also had come to Punjab. So that's a different story. So anyway, so these missionaries, they reached Punjab. But when I say they reached missionaries, I should actually just say that one missionary reached Punjab. So if you look at these people and their zeal, you will realize, if you just look at their personal lives, we realize that what is it that they were really after. In 1833, when William Reed and John Lorry, they decided to come to India, they and their wives, they started from the USA and they reached Calcutta, but they paid a huge cost for their work. William Reed became sick, and in fact, John Lorry's wife, she died as soon as they reached India. So out of the four people, one died. And then William Reed became very sick. He became so sick that they had to send him back to America. But while going back to America on the ship with his wife, he died on the way. And so eventually, only out of the four, only one person was left. And he spoke to the people there. He met Alexander Duff and Charles Trevelyan in Calcutta. And in discussion with them, he decided to come to Punjab. So he traveled alone. He came to Punjab. And Punjab at that time, half of Punjab was under the British control and other half was in the control of the great Sikh ruler, Maharaja Ranjit Singh. So Maharaja Ranjit Singh is a legendary king of Punjab. And he, governed a great part of Punjab, Kashmir, and even Afghanistan. A fierce ruler he was, very, popular in history. So, and there was a river that marked the boundary between the the territory of Ranjit Singh and of the British. So when John Laurie reached Punjab, so actually they wanted first they wanted to go to a place called Ambala, but there the British resident there, the British official in charge of that area wasn't very happy with the missionaries. So he further moved to Ludhiana. And in Ludhiana, there was thankfully a British political agent, Captain Wade, who had already started a school. No, British had to start schools because the charter said that you have to start schools. But these were military leaders, these were commercial people. They did not know how to run schools. So Captain Wade was very happy that a missionary is here. So he said, I'll give you the school, you run the school. So he supported John Laurie, and John Laurie took care of that, began to take care of that school. But John Laurie's health continued to deteriorate, and he wasn't really keeping very well. He went and lived in the hills in the Himalayas for some time, but could not really go on for a long time. He had to go back, but not before he made a journey to Amritsar, which was Amritsar and then Lahore, where Maharaja Ranjit Singh's court was there. So it is a very interesting incident. Maharaja Ranjit Singh, when he heard that a missionary had come and he's starting a school, he wanted him to shift to Lahore. He says, you come here, you stay with me, and you teach my, the children of my generals. I want you to teach them English. So John Laurie was very happy that the Maharaja, the king himself is asking him. So he was very happy. They had very good conversations. Maharaja Ranjit Singh asked him a lot about the Christian religion and all those theological issues, political situation in the USA. So he had learned a lot from him. And John Laurie even gifted him a Bible. But the school could not be started because John Laurie insisted that as a missionary, I must teach the Bible. And Maharaja Ranjit Singh would not have that. So, but they parted ways in a cordial manner. So John Laurie came back, and then another group of missionaries began from Boston in the USA, and they came to India. And this second batch contained people, I think there was Wilson and John Newton. So John Newton and his wife, and this is John Wilson and his wife, the four of them came. It's very interesting if you look at the lives of these missionaries. When I first read about them, I was very inspired and touched. John Newton, when he came to India in 1834, he was 24 years old. His wife was 22 years old. So they were very, very young. If you look around and look at people who are 24 and 22, and just imagine that they came. Both of them, uh, Elizabeth and John Newton, they got married in on October 16th, 1834, and on you know 16th October 1834, and on November 6th, I think they boarded a ship. So they boarded a ship not to go on a honeymoon, but they boarded a ship to come to India as missionaries. So it took them 1 year to reach Punjab. So they reached here, and they of course first went to Bengal, as the sea route was. Uh, and John Newton picked up an old printing machine, a printing press there, uh, and came to Punjab. And he started his work there, uh, his evangelistic work. He was not really a printer, but he taught himself the art of printing, and he started working there. So much so that people now say that he is one of the major figures in the Punjabi language, in the development of Punjabi language. So this is some of the issues that I had in my mind, that these Americans, uh, why are they here? I mean, this is something that probably the critics should know, that what are these missionaries doing here? They are obviously uh, the the British. They started sending their missionaries almost 10 years after the American missionaries had been here. So if British imperialists, if the East India Company really thought that they can colonize our mind by bringing missionaries, then they would have definitely called the British missionaries first. But we see the British missionaries came almost in 1844 and later, and the Americans came before them. So that's an important historical fact to remember. The other thing about this thing is that missionaries, who were they really serving? That is very important questions. As I said earlier, that if any foreign power wants to establish itself, it will always target the elite. It will always target the dominant groups in any society, so that if the dominant group is favorable to them, then the rest of the people will follow suit. So that's an important thing. And how do you serve the interest of the dominant class, dominant people? You do that first of all by responding to or being favorable to their religious ideas and their religious practices. Second thing is that you support their educational efforts. You educate them, you treat them well, you give them the opening in the government. That's how you strengthen your rule there. Now, this is where the government and the missionaries, they parted ways. Uh, so even though missionaries worked in the area of languages, they worked on the languages which were neglected by the British government, by the Indian government of that time. Now, one thing we must remember that we criticize the British a lot by saying that, oh, after Macaulay's Minute, they imposed English language on us. So we talk about this, the Macaulay's Minute of 1835. We say that, they harmed our languages, they neglected our languages. But many people, in fact, I think 90% of the people do not talk about and do not even know about that. In 1837, the British East India Company had passed a series of acts. And in that, Act 29 said that in all the areas which we are governing, we will use the local language, right? The local language will be used as the official language. So what had happened because of the spread of the Mughal rule and the Muslim rule and the Persian culture has spread across India, and in many administrative units, the language of governance was Persian. I mean, as far as let's say Calcutta, Persian was a very popular language. Arabic was popular there. If you know something about Raja Ram Mohan Roy, now Raja Ram Mohan Roy wrote his first book uh, in Persian and Arabic. I think it had Arabic preface, and the book was in Persian. Tuhfat al-Muwahhiddin, you know. So the gift of monotheism, Tuhfat al-Muwahhiddin, I think that was the title of the book. So he wrote that. So it gives you an idea that how far was the reach of the Persian culture. But the Act 29 of 1837 of the East India Company said that in the local areas we will use the regional language. So, for example, in Bengal, we will try and use Bengali, and in Madras we use Tamil or other languages that are there. So they were promoting the local languages. The trouble in Punjab was that Punjab was a mix of many languages. Uh, so, especially, the rural people. So, if you understand a little bit of the geography of North India, you see these rivers kind of divide them. So there is this Jamna river that flows through Delhi and UP. So people on the eastern side of Jamna preferred Hindi, and people on the western side of Jamna would prefer other languages, uh, especially Punjabi. But if you go further down, the language keeps changing. Uh, and so there was not one single language. The elite continued to speak Persian. Even the 10th Guru of the Sikhs, he wrote his book in Persian. Uh, Even though many of these gurus were, of course, speaking Punjabi and composing in Punjabi. But Punjabi was not really the preferred language of composition of literary and historical works. People were writing either in Persian or even in Braj. The Braj, which was one of the earlier versions, or I mean, it is still spoken, but something out of which Hindi came. So Braj was a very rich language. So even the Sikhs were using Braj. They were using Braj. They were using Persian. So what I'm telling you is that how languages, the popular language, the elite languages, the dominant languages that were there, uh, they did not stop missionaries from developing the lesser developed languages. So missionaries were there. John Newton, he had taken his printing press there. The good thing about, or the interesting thing about missionaries is that they want to communicate their message to all sections of the society. Whereas the government, it wants that there should be one language of administration so that its work becomes easy. So when the British government wanted to, remove Persian, Persian was, of course, a foreign language which people did not speak, common people did not speak. Only the literary and the high officials spoke. Interestingly, even Maharaja Ranjit Singh had Persian as his court language. So they wanted to replace it. The British wanted to replace it. So which language should be used here? Now, they found that the elite was speaking Urdu. Urdu was being spoken, and they said, we'll put Urdu uh, as the official language. So because of the large numbers of Muslims in Punjab at that time. And we must remember that Hindus and Sikhs were in a minority in Punjab. Muslims were the majority, and even the educated and literate Sikhs and Hindus were reading and writing in Urdu. So it was natural for the government to say that Urdu will be the language of the people, or the language of administration. Uh, so it would have been the end of life for many other languages in Punjab, because government is supporting uh, one language, Urdu language. But what you realize is that the presence of missionaries gives life, blood to all the other languages which do not get support of the government. Now, this is the interesting logic that works here, that missionaries, they become the alternate patrons of the local languages. They become the alternate patrons of the of Punjabi itself, because missionaries want to reach their message to all the sections of society. So they begin publishing, of course, in Urdu, which is for the literate people. They also start publishing in Hindi, because a lot of people in Punjab did speak Hindi, and because current Haryana, Himachal, and all those areas were part of Punjab at that time. So Hindi was more popular there. They also published in Kashmiri, because a lot of people from Muslims from Kashmir actually had escaped, migrated from there to the British territory of Ludhiana. Because when Maharaja Ranjit Singh became the king of Kashmir, uh, he gave a tough time to Muslims there, and many of them migrated to the British area for protection. So the missionaries are also printing material in Kashmiri, in Persian, of course, and in Urdu and in Punjabi. So these linguistic works were going on, and they became the patrons of these languages and developed those languages and printed in those. Uh, if we go back a little bit more in history, we realize that even before American missionaries came here, we have to refer to William Carey. William Carey, as we all know, I mean, no account of linguistics in India can be complete without mentioning him. When he reached Bengal in 1793 and started publishing, 1800, he published the Bengali New Testament. By 1811, he had 11 and 12, he had already published a Punjabi grammar. In 1812, William Carey had published a Punjabi grammar. And by 1815, he had published a Punjabi New Testament. So there's a lot of work in Punjabi that had already been done by William Carey, sitting in Calcutta and Serampore. And those books, those scriptures were brought to Punjab. But when John Newton looked at those translations and looked at the language spoken by people, he decided to redo or revise the Punjabi translation. And he also decided to write a new grammar of Punjabi and a new dictionary of Punjabi. So John Newton, in fact, through his work, people have called him that he is the father of the modern Punjabi prose, because he created a new dictionary. He created a new grammar in 1851, and his brother-in-law, Levi Janvier, he created a new dictionary in 1854. And these dictionaries and these grammar books became the bedrock of much of the development of Punjabi language. You have to kind of appreciate and understand that these are the efforts which were not supported by the government. Right? These were the missionary, their own endeavors, their own motivation. It's interesting to note this, because in Punjab, the friendship, there was a very close collaboration between the missionaries and the British, officials, because many of the British officials by then had become evangelicals. You know, unlike an earlier era, and also in many other parts, we see that the British officials, many of whom followed utilitarian philosophy, they did not like the mission work. They did not even subscribe to the Christian faith. But in Punjab, the situation was very different. Here, some of the top officials were indeed strong supporters of missions. But even when these people are strong supporters of missions in their private capacity, they did not use that authority to impose the language that their government had chosen. Similarly, the missionaries, even though they were very strong, some of them have very strong bonds with the colonial officials, they did not support the colonial policy of promoting the Urdu language only. So that's an important thing for us to note. And so the couple of points that I have made is that, number one, that the missionaries who came to Punjab, they were not following the colonial agenda. They were governed by their own agenda, which was to reach the people with the gospel in their own languages. And uh, they were not fulfilling any colonial agenda, even when they were close to the colonial officials. Second thing that we must know, and what I'm saying is that, how do the literary historians of later period, of independent period in Punjab, look at the work of the missionaries, and especially Presbyterian missionaries? If you look at the assessment by Punjabi scholars, you will realize that they are speaking very glowingly, and they're very appreciative of the efforts of the Punjab of the missionaries who work in Punjab, because they realize that if it were not the missionaries who modernized Punjabi, it would have faded away as a dialect. Now they are the ones that they realize that the work of the missionaries has increased and improved the stature of Punjabi. You know, this is testified in number of studies by Punjabi scholars. And I have a book here with me. It's a full-fledged study of Punjabi literature. It says the contribution of Christian missionaries to Punjabi literature. It's a full, it's in Punjabi, it's a full-length book study. And it says that what missionaries have done for Punjab. Now, it says, for example, the first original novel in Punjab, was written. It came from the missionary press. So Christians were the first ones who gave us the Punjabi novel. It came in 1882, called Jyoti Hriday. So that was the first Punjabi novel. So Christians were not just translating the Bible or printing the tracts, or doing linguistic books to help them translate, but they also enriched the Punjabi literature through their literary work. So the first novel was written in 1882. In fact, the first Punjabi novel written by a Punjabi came only in 1898. It's like 16 years later. So this missionary work preceded it. Then the short story, different genres of literature. The short story was also given by the missionary work, because many of the missionaries were rewriting biblical events as short stories. So the genre of short stories also developed because of the work of the missionaries. The biographies in Punjabi were in modern Punjabi. Obviously, there were some biographies prose biographies available in Punjabi. They were basically hagiographies of Sikh gurus, especially Guru Nanak Dev Ji. So his uh, biography was there, but the modern biography uh, with the modern vocabulary, modern idiom, and far more, complexity were the work of the missionaries. The travelogues were written by missionaries. That genre was also introduced by missionaries. There was uh, Asia di Sal, that was a travelogue about the Asian continent, was also produced by the missionaries. They also introduced the essay writing. Uh, they also, and very importantly, so apart from essay, the whole tradition of translations. In fact, the Punjabi scholars, they appreciate the missionary contribution to the translation activities. And they, in fact, are very glad to know that the first Punjabi prose book is the Bible. So many Punjabi scholars, in fact, everybody who studied Punjabi, history of Punjabi literature and language, they appreciate and they write with pride that the Christian Bible is the first prose book in our, uh, in our language. So missionaries also introduced one-act plays, uh, and then obviously the whole idea of the printing press, the typeface, all these things is what the missionaries brought. Uh, so, so when we talk about the uh, influence of missionaries in India, contribution of missionaries in India, it is somehow an easy thing to say because we have the template. Okay, missionaries worked in the area of education and healthcare and printing. But I think it is important to bring out these aspects that how historically they were important. Because if missionaries hadn't been working, what would have been the fate of many of these languages? I think they still would have been struggling. Missionaries, they produced a model where languages and literatures can be sustained by people without the support of the government. So in that sense, also missionaries became they gave rise to a civil society. So if we look at many of these mission conferences that were happening, so a lot of prominent people, even non-Christians, were coming and discussing how we can improve our languages, our literature, and education system. Now, while we are talking about language, let me also go back to the issue of education, because the medium of education again was a big controversy. In 1884, when the Hunter Commission, 1882, I think, when the Hunter Commission was here, and it was looking at how we should really educate the people, the medium of instruction became again a very difficult issue in Punjab. As I said, Punjab was a mix of languages, so there was a fight between Punjabi, Urdu, and Hindi. Which is the language that should be used to teach. In many schools, Persian was still being taught. You know, it is very difficult, any language to phase out very easily. So Persian was still taught, Urdu was being taught, Hindi was in some places were taught. When the missionaries went and testified in front of the Education Commission, they very strongly supported that Punjabi and to some extent Hindi should not be neglected. They said the government must support these languages also. Charles Foreman, after whose name we have a very famous college in Lahore in Pakistan, Lahore Foreman Christian College. Now, he testified before the Hunter Commission that we must support wherever possible the language of the people, the language of the rural people, which is Punjabi, which is the village folks speak that language, but we cannot neglect it. So these are some very important points that these people were making. So as I said, it is good to point out that missionaries worked in the area of education and printing and this thing. But the larger questions that are behind it, they must be also addressed. They must also be looked at, and all these ideas must be, produced to counter the false history that is being projected. Missionaries did much more than that, and not just language, but in field of medical care. I just as I conclude, I must mention that in 1894, missionary women. I mean, we're talking about leadership of women in today's time, but 130, 140 years ago, it was the women who were leading uh, these great pioneering movements of providing education to Indian women. So the first medical college for women in entire Asia was started in 1894 in Ludhiana, called Christian Medical, I mean, which is now called as Christian Medical College, CMC Ludhiana. So that's something that missionaries, the contribution. I was just reading recently how the kind of sacrifices these missionaries were making. John Newton came here when he was a 24-year-old young man. He died here, in his late 70s. He never went back. He lost his wife uh, while working here, and his son started working on the things that he left. His son E.P. Newton. He also worked on the dictionary. Died in 1924. So they sacrificed a lot, and not only sacrificed, they suffered a lot. We're talking about persecution today. The persecution was then as well. Uh, Levi Janvier, who worked on the dictionary, he was actually killed in a religious fair when he was distributing the Bibles there. So those things have happened. Uh, the great movement of Christians, you know, uh, it after the independence movement and the national movement uh, gained ground. Uh, so many of these areas of social reform were not being really followed up. And then numbers of people became important. Politics became more dominant, and communities getting divided on religious lines. So all those sorts of things happened. Um, and in 1947, when India got freedom, we know that partition also took place, and Punjab was one of the worst hit areas, in fact, the worst hit areas, Punjab and Delhi. And then in the east, you had Bengal, where a lot of riots happened between Hindus and Sikhs on one side and Muslims on the other. It was during that time, so I must actually say that at the end, that Christians again were at the forefront. This is something that is often not talked about, but Christians were at the forefront of providing relief work to refugees on both sides of the border. There was a time when a lot of Muslims were gathering. There was a Purana Killa in Delhi where the Muslims who wanted to move and they wanted safety, so they went to the Pakistan High Commission and they said, please protect us. So they put them in Purana Killa. But so many Muslims were there that many of them had to be moved to Humayun's tomb. And it was difficult to manage all those. So the ICS, Indian Civil Services, the civil servant who was in charge of providing the relief work, he was overwhelmed, KB Lal. So he spoke to the principal of St. Stephen's College, who was his batchmate, that you please mobilize the church to support, to provide the relief work. So not many people have recorded this, but St. Stephen's College, St. Stephen's School, St. Stephen's Hospital, and a lot of these Christian institutions in Delhi were providing relief work. And Christians, because they were religiously neutral, they could serve both the communities. They could serve the Hindus and Muslims, Hindus and Sikhs and Muslims. It is said that when Muslims were all living in their tents, nobody could go there. They would trust nobody. No Indian official they will trust. But when they see a Christian priest wearing a cassock entering their, refugee settlements, they will believe him. So that was the kind of impact that Christian community in that era, that area had, and not only in Delhi but also in Punjab. And a lot of these schools, Christian hospitals, they were serving and treating all the victims of these partition riots. In Batala, Bering College became a center where a lot of these people, especially the Muslims, gathered before they moved to Pakistan. So that's another great. I mean, not just the missionaries, but I'm saying that post-independent Christian community did in the service of the nation. So I'll stop here and we can make it a little bit more interactive. Thank you, Brother Babu.